welcome to day 3, Population Day, in our series of talks focusing on 6 stressors identified in the World Scientist Climate Emergency Warning of 2019. I'll read out the population clause. Population. The world population must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced within a framework that ensures social integrity. These policies make family planning services available to all people, remove barriers to their access, and achieve full gender equity, including primary and secondary education as a global norm for all, especially girls and young women. I would like to say a few words about why we're doing this series and why we're here today. Our Planet in Crisis pre-COP26 mission is to gain action, action, action. We must create action now. Action for COP26 and action at the COP26 next year, which, as you know, has been postponed because of this virus. Our pre-COP event, Planet in Crisis, Creating Action for COP26, presents through a series of online events the science and the actions needed now at COP26 and in the near future in order to protect the future of our children and every living creature. Underlying this is a Scientists Warning Europe mission to protect the future of our planet, our children, and other creatures that share our world. We are primarily representing the 3 Scientists Warning of 1992, the first one over 25 years ago, the second warning in 2017, and the climate emergency warning of 2019. Their intention, and hence our mission, is the same. It's to bring about a great change in humanity's stewardship of the earth, and in order to prevent irretrievable destruction of our global home, the only home we have. I just remind you all again that all questions should go in the chat and they'll all be dealt with after the talk. I now have the honor to introduce our speaker, Robin Maynard, who's been Director of Population Matters since 2017. Population Matters is the only population concerned NGO in the UK that seems to take population growth concerns seriously. It might even be said it's one of only about a dozen that do so in the whole world. Robin's a long-standing and passionate supporter of the population cause. He began his career over 30 years ago with Friends of the Earth. He was involved as a volunteer before the Chernobyl disaster, and he got involved in tracking radioactive fallout and securing compensation for farmers. He's held senior positions in the Friends of the Earth since for the charity farm, which I actually hadn't heard of. It's an interesting one, Championing Family Farms, the Forestry Commission, Soil Association, and more recently Wildlife Trust. He also did a short spell introducing Radio 4's Farming Today program, which involved him visiting the aftermath of Chernobyl 10 years on, and also getting involved with the Bhopal disaster. With that, I'd be pleased to hand over to Robin to give his presentation entitled No Regrets, Hopeful, and that's full of hope, not just hopeful, solutions to climate change and everything else, pretty much. Over to you, Robin. You'll need to unmute.
Robin, you need to unmute. You need to unmute yourself, Robin.
Okay. You need to unmute, Robin. Can we not unmute him?
Let me turn back on.
Yep. No, I think we're now. I think we were fighting on over the mute button because 2 of us had
okay.
control. But listen, Bill, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be taking part in these webinars linked to the World Scientist Warning. You know, one of the most important pronouncements that have been made repeatedly over the years and not heard by enough people. So I'm so pleased to be doing this. And here I am in my little study in Bristol, England, but I very much hope and think that I'm talking to people all across the world. And this is a world issue involving people north, south, west and east. So thank you very much for joining us. So as Bill said, my title was deliberate in terms of hopeful with 2 L's, because when those of us who have to talk around population and choose to talk around population are often thought of as, we're pessimistic and we're misanthropic, we hate people, we hate babies, we're restrictive and all the rest of it. Well, I'm certainly not, and I know that my colleagues here aren't. I've got 2 young children. I love them to bits, my 2 daughters. And I really think this agenda is about being pro-people. It's about empowering choice. It's about enabling rights. And it's about promoting positive, available, non-coercive solutions. So that's what I'm really going to try and get across in my short spell this afternoon. In the UK, it's in the afternoon anyway. And I also want to talk about this because it's one of the most impactful solutions for addressing climate change, which many more people ought to know about. And my title is actually taken from an initiative called Project Drawdown, and a quote from the coordinator and founder of that, Paul Hawken. And when he set up Project Drawdown and he assembled an international group of researchers, their only mission was to map, measure and model the most substantive available solutions to climate change, all of which should be underpinned by peer-reviewed research. And those of you who are familiar with Project Drawdown will know this, but if you haven't already looked at it, I really urge you to do so. But they really had they had a long list of nearly 100 solutions. They had a short list of the top 10, and in the top 10, of which they originally published in 2017, at 6 and 7 were educating girls and family planning. Now there's a synergy between those two, because when you enable girls to enter education, ideally go through secondary into tertiary education, they will be able to make informed choices. They will have more autonomy over their bodies, over their lives, and they will be more likely to choose to have fewer children at a greater spacing over a longer period of time. So when Project Drawdown put those at 6 and 7, enabling girls to access education and to access contraception, they realized there was this synergy. So they combined them. And when they combined them, that was the #1 solution to climate change. It saved more carbon dioxide over the 30 years of that project projection, up to 2050, than all onshore wind and offshore wind combined, which is an amazing fact. And one I am always amazed that more people don't know and talk about. And this is how we portrayed it for Population Matters. There are the sort of top 5 solutions. And you can see it's a pretty massive 102, gigatons. And I'm told that 1 gigaton is worth 100 million elephants in sort of comparative weight. I mean, it's an odd statistic, but there you have it. It's an awful lot of carbon dioxide being saved. And it's way above a lot of the other solutions that you hear more frequently promoted. And so Paul Hawken came up with this quote, which I just think is a brilliant quote, when he was talking about solutions, and particularly about educating girls and family planning. And he called these no regrets solutions. And it's what's so powerful about this is that there are all these good things that those 2 positive solutions provide. But on the side, almost, they deliver one of the most powerful levers that are available for avoiding emissions by curbing population growth, and so curbing emissions of climate change, of greenhouse gas emissions over time. So that's why he calls them a no regret solution. Now, what's interesting is that Project Drawdown has done a review which came out earlier this year, and it's under a new leadership team, and there's a slightly different emphasis, a change of emphasis. So actually, it is no longer enabling girls access to education and contraception, which is #1, but now it is reducing food waste, which is a pretty mighty 87.5 gigatons of CO2 saved over those 30 years. But educating girls and family planning, which is now, and you'll see in the bottom right, this new heading, a slightly more anodyne heading of health and education, that still saves 85.4 gigatons. I mean, that's pretty amazing. The next highest one after food waste, health and education, is plant-rich diets. Now you always hear, I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan. I eat a little bit of sustainable meat. I used to work for the Organic Farming Organization, so I'm pro small small grass-fed livestock farmers, if you like. But a plant-rich diet is 65.02 gigatons. That's 20 gigatons less than educating girls and family planning combined. And yet you hear about that much more than that key solution of addressing both population growth and climate change emissions growth. And there's something in this which we'll return to, into how you communicate these issues. And of course, just to go back to that, sorry, just, yeah, that's what I want to go back to. At the moment in the world, there are 270 million young women and girls who do not have access to the safe modern family planning and choice that they want. Now, that's a UN statistic. Now, when I started using that statistic 2 years ago, the figure was 230 million girls. But because of population growth since 1990, the UN has recalibrated, and another 40 million young women have joined that list. So it's actually getting worse. There is less, or rather, there is more unmet need, less access to choice and contraception than there was previously. So this is a very interesting issue. And I suppose my sort of question that I might pose before we move on to the science is, what, have you ever heard, I mean, I've never heard the mainstream NGOs, the environment groups, Friends of the Earth that I used to work for, Greenpeace, WWF, Extinction Rebellion, do not talk about population. They do not talk about access to family planning, access to choice and education in the context of curbing climate change. We might return to why that is. So the other thing underpinning this argument is the science. This is from the International Panel on Climate Change, 2 reports, 2014 and 18. They both, in the text, identify population growth as key important drivers of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yet again, we don't hear that outside of the reports unless you've really delved into them. It's not just climate change, it's biodiversity as well. So the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, the equivalent of the IPCC for biodiversity as opposed to climate change, have also identified population growth as a key driver of global biodiversity loss. And they say you can't ignore these indirect upstream drivers. And of course, your own excellent organization that the coordinators of this event are promoting, the World Scientist Warning, very specifically mentioned population growth and talked about examining and changing our individual behaviors. That's really powerful for a group of leading scientists, 20,000 scientists, and I'm sure Bill and Ed and Brian will say it's more now, from 184 countries around the world making that point. So the scientific evidence is there. We know this is a no regrets solution. And when I say the solution, these are positive, non-coercive, choice-based solutions. And in terms of enabling people to live better lives, one of the key measures, in fact, probably the key measure, is something called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short. Now, this year for World Population Day, which falls on the 11th of July, Population Matters focused on the SDGs because the UN had just produced a report which said that, in effect, these wonderful goals, which are aiming to achieve decent lives for all on a healthy planet by 2030, as things stood, almost all of them would be missed. And from our perspective, and from many other people's perspective, a significant factor is population growth. They are being overwhelmed in terms of their achievement by the numbers of people who are needing to be lifted up into better lives, and who are then undermining some of the infrastructure measures that are in place. It's extremely challenging to deliver all the SDGs as they are currently constructed without addressing population growth. So we've had that figure that I gave you of, just 2 years ago, the UN estimated 230 million women with unmet need for access to safe family planning. Now it's 270 million. In that same period of time, since 1990, which that calculation is made over, the human population has grown from 5.3 billion to 7.8 billion, so an extra 2.5 billion people on the planet. And we are seeing, I think, on the the right of the screen by the side of the SDGs graphic, which is the one you see all around. And I get my little badge out, you probably see it. This is my little badge with all those 17 SDGs round in a ring. But a number of those are being hit pretty hard. So we know also that food security is really challenged by population growth. So the World Resources Institute and the World Bank has calculated that due to population growth, there will be a need for a 56% increase in food production by 2050 compared to what we were producing in 2010. That's a pretty massive gap. And they talk about hunger had grown in step with increasing population, as the UN quote. Now, when you have that increased agricultural production, that means more impacts on biodiversity, more impacts on ecosystem services. We also know from the figures up here that the number of girls not in school has increased in sub-Saharan Africa by about 7 million young girls since 2007 due to population growth. So this is a real challenge to achieve these good things of the SDGs without also addressing population growth. And yet, as Paul Hawken pointed out, there are really positive solutions available which would enable people to be lifted out of poverty, to fulfill their lives and their potential, to have their choice, but they need to be brought into place. And they have been brought into place in many countries around the world. And a notable example is Bangladesh. Bangladesh saw its fertility rate fall in the 1970s to 80s when it stood at about 7 to 8 children per woman to 2.3, 2.2 now. And that was due to a 25-year program promoting choice. It was run at the community level. It was often run by women community levels, and it was not in any way coercive. And the interesting thing about Bangladesh, which is a very hard challenged country, you know, it's got the Sundarbans with incoming sea level rise from climate change threatening huge areas of low-lying parts of its land and its population. It's got hostile neighbors, and it's got, you know, 3 or 4 rivers coming in from the Himalayas with the meltwaters of the glaciers coming down. So it's really hard pressed. But Bangladesh is the only of what the UN call impoverished nations to have achieved the precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals. And they recognize that was achieved because of their proactive, positive population, family planning, access to contraception programs. There is a tremendous challenge to do all the good things that we want to see with the SDGs and to curb climate change. Because if you want to lift people out of poverty, you have to enable them to develop more. And you have to enable them, that means to use more energy. So the #1 SDG, which is the top left-hand corner, no poverty, it's calculated that transition out of poverty for that SDG 1, the resource use per person projected by the UN necessary for that is 71% higher by 2050 than today. So that means a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases, even with technological achievements, will be released. So it seems blindingly obvious. And here's a slide which I always thought suggested it was blindingly obvious. This slide was shared at a conference that I attended in 2017. You can see it's actually a slide from WWF, 6 graphs. Top left, world population, then carbon dioxide, then freshwater use, then fertilizer consumption, then marine fish capture, then tropical forest loss. They all look quite similar. And there's the population growth one. That was one on the top left. 4 speakers used that graph at that conference. Not one of them referred to the top left graph, human population growth. But I would argue if you lay them over, if you lay the population graph over all the others, there is a correlation. So let's quickly do that. That's over CO2. That's over, what's that one over? That one is over freshwater use. That's over fertilizer use. That's over marine fisheries capture. That's over tropical forest loss. I would argue there's a correlation. Now, when one talks about the SDGs, people will often say, oh, you're talking about poor people. This is a typical population concern organization pointing at poor people in Africa or Asia or Latin America. No, we have to look at our own house in order in the rich developed countries, because look at this graph. We consume far more of the Earth's resources per capita inequitably than those poor, those poorer developing high fertility countries. So here in the UK, that's slightly out of date, that figure. We would now require 3 Earths if everybody on Earth sought to live as we do. So we have to address consumption and equity in the global north, as well as enabling the global south to develop and to have that choice over its family size. This is a graph showing per capita consumption, per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see, you know, the red, the warmer ones are where that currently is. Australia, the Middle East, America, and then of course, you know, Europe and the UK and Russia are pretty hot as well. So very low emissions per capita in the developing world. But look at this, this is where per country. And what you're seeing is, yes, it's still high in the developed world, but you can see that in India and in China, it's starting to grow, because those countries which have had some of the highest fertility growth now coming down in some parts, but they are developing, and why shouldn't they? But that means their consumption rates are going up as well. So their greenhouse gas emissions per country are growing too. So we absolutely have to look at our individual eco actions and our individual greenhouse gas emissions. And this graph here is really making that point home for those of us who live in the global north and the rich developed countries. This is a graph showing the work done by Lund University. And there again, their premise was, let's look at all the eco actions that are recommended and available and see which one will make the greatest difference in terms of individual greenhouse gas climate change emissions. And some of you will be familiar with this study from Lund University in Scandinavia by Wines and Nicholas. And the stunning fact that came out of it, and there are some controversies about it, but it still holds, that when they looked at somebody who lived in a rich country such as the UK, such as myself, choosing to have one less child, a smaller family, was the most effective eco action one could take because of our very high per capita greenhouse gas emissions. It was far more effective than living car free, than avoiding a round trip on a transatlantic flight, an aeroplane, buying green energy, switching to electric car, etc. Not that all of those things aren't important. All of those things should be done. And yet that significantly greater act of choosing a smaller family, 20 times more impactful than the next one in that bar chart, is not promoted by governments. Governments primarily, in the same study found, talk about recycling, changing your light bulbs, insulating your house, you know, bicycling. Yes, good things, but they're nice, easy, uncontroversial things. And governments find it very, very hard to talk about encouraging people to make that individual choice to have a smaller family. Now, this is spread over time, of course. This is over a generation in terms of making that child-free or child smaller family choice. But given the timescales we have to do everything. And as I'll show later, if across the world, every other family had one less child, we would have 1 billion fewer people on the planet by 2050. And that would lead to even fewer by 2100. So it's a long-term investment, but there's a change within a generation. The other thing people talk about is, you know, when you talk about population, and I think this is where I get to why on earth won't more NGOs talk about this issue, is that, you know, look at me there. The majority of heads of NGOs in the rich developed world, in the UK, in the US, across Europe, are white middle-aged old men like me. And too many of us feel guilty and riddled with all sorts of repressed problems about who we are and why we are and what our countries have done, much of which is justified. But it shouldn't justify lack of action, and it shouldn't justify lack of promotion of the facts and of the scientific evidence. And what I found, much to my relief and huge pleasure, is that my colleagues and partner organizations in the global south, and this is in Nigeria, have no such inhibitions talking about population. This was at an event for World Population Day in 2019, and I'm accompanied in this lineup. You can probably recognize me with my short sleeves and looking slightly hot, but there is the Minister of State for Lagos for the environment at the second left. The lady in the headscarf is the Deputy Director General of the Nigerian Population Commission. The gentleman in the traditional Nigerian costume is Dr. Aminu Kanu, who is the head of the Nigerian Conservation Foundation. He invited Population Matters over for this co-meeting in Lagos. They had no problems talking about population. They were more outspoken than me. The minister said our population is set to double from 200 million to 400 million over the next 30 to 40 years. We cannot cope. Our infrastructure is collapsing. And I can promise you, Mr. Robin, and he pointed to me, if this meeting was held in the northeast of Nigeria, you wouldn't be allowed to go there because of Boko Haram. It causes social unrest. So people are not afraid of talking about this issue in the places where it affects them most. And that's what annoys me about wealthy, privileged people in NGOs in the West who presume to speak on behalf of others. We have to address consumption, of course. Consumption and population go hand in hand. But this is from an interesting study by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They found, looking at 60 of the commonly available resources used in developed society, all of them had gone up in use apart from a few. And those were radioactive isotopes, asbestos, certain pesticides, all of these things regulated by government, and yes, wool, a natural fiber substituted by man-made petrochemical derived fibers. So we're not doing very well on reducing consumption. It's a hell of a struggle. So if we don't address population alongside consumption, we are facing a very, very difficult challenge. And thankfully, some NGOs do accept this. This is a graph produced by the Global Footprint Network for Earth Overshoot Day this year, which is only just not long gone. And this is the first NGO I've seen to include in the range of pillars, they call these pillar solutions, 5 pillar solutions. Population is there. And I'm so grateful for the Global Footprint Network, who are the architects of what we understand of global footprints and calculating our footprint, to have put this out there, because maybe this will encourage some of those other NGOs to acknowledge population is something that we can and must address for the good of people and planet. And the reason why I'm so focused on this and why I'm so hopeful is because there is a huge opportunity. This is a graph produced by the UN for their long-term projections of the world's total human population by 2100. The orange dotted line is for 7.3 billion. The blue thick line is 10.9, and the dotted green, sort of sludgy green, is 15.6. And that is their low, medium, and high range. And that is predicated on a range of factors, but in particular on whether or not, on average, across the world, families, that every second family will have one less child or one more child. The actual figure is half a child per woman, which I think is a weird statistic. So much better, one more or one less child per every second family. That means a difference. I think it's about, if my maths is right, it's over 8 billion. It's 8.3 billion difference between the low and the high. And we can achieve that lower orange dotted graph through positive, available, non-coercive means, meeting the needs, the unmet needs of those 272 million women around the world, and ensuring that girls get into education, enabling these good things, which will help tackle climate change in a hugely significant way, as Project Drawdown has shown. So I just find it so hard why NGOs won't talk about it. We've gone through some of the reasons. I think maybe the discussion will bring some of them up. Partly, many of you may have seen the report that came out in the UK. It was in The Guardian, and it was a report which was headlined, "Just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions," study says. And this was the Guardian's write-up of the Carbon Majors report of 2017. But actually, when you look at the actual report, go past the Guardian article, the top 100 are not all companies. They're China coal, they're Russia coal, they're India coal. They're companies where they are companies that produce things that we are using, we consumers. So this deflection from individual choice and responsibility to big bad corporates or big bad governments is very convenient, but I don't think it's honest. And the other one is that binary focus on consumption you know, you can't talk about population, you can only talk about consumption. When I was at Friends of the Earth, the mantra was, we in the West, in the rich West, are 20% of the world's population. We are responsible for 80% of the world's consumption. We cannot, you know, we cannot talk about population, it's only about consumption. Well, things have changed. We have to talk about both, because quite rightly, India, China, parts of Africa, quite rightly, are becoming consumers too. And I can promise you, when I was in Lagos, I saw an awful lot of very expensive cars in the center of Lagos. I saw Rolls Royces, I saw Maseratis, I saw Lamborghinis. Outside, I didn't see that, but in the center. So we have to accept that we have to address both of these, just as the Global Footprint Network has said, and Laurel came up with this, you know, that lovely quote. I think it's a false dichotomy that you talk about one or the other. You have to talk about consumption and you have to talk about population. They go hand in hand, and there are different solutions for different parts of the world. And here's our patron, David Attenborough, talking in the recent Netflix film, where at the beginning of the film, he said this every time, you know, over his lifetime, the population has trebled. But over 50 years, it's more than doubled. And as those graphs show, there's a correlation. His other quote, which I'll end with and open up for questions, is, all our environmental problems become easier to solve with fewer people and harder and ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people. Thank you very much for listening, and do take me to task.
Thank you, Robin. I should have my picture up now with a bit of luck. That was an excellent and all-encompassing talk. I'm sure if there are any gaps in our knowledge on population, you filled them. I'll take the questions from the beginning. There are a couple I think will probably group together. Just find them. Yes, the first was Francis, I may pronounce his Voica, and the second was following on from Ed Gemmell. Yeah, this is essentially about, don't we have to blame the people in the West a bit more? I'll read the first one. While the wealthy worldwide, and mostly in the Western world, have personal eco footprints many times larger than world average, isn't it our own population of overprivileged that we need to target at least as much as directing support to parts of the world without good education and health provision? And I think Ed's is more aligned to the CO2 emissions aspect. That, following on from Francis' comment, UK individual CO2 emissions is 8.3 tons per annum, whereas Nigeria, for example, is only 0.49. On the basis we need to save the planet within 10 years, should not any population intervention be most useful here rather than in developing countries? That makes sense. If you agree with this, then what do you propose we get done about it here?
Yeah, no, I hope that it's always hard when you're sort of whipping through a talk, but I hope I made it plain that we absolutely always focus on consumption alongside population at Population Matters. We're not a monomaniac organization. They go hand in hand, as Laurel Hanscom from Global Footprint Network said. Yes, and historically, not least the UK, where the Industrial Revolution started off in 1750, we are responsible for the vast majority of historic greenhouse gas emissions. But the rest of the world is catching up, and they have a right, an equitable right to catch up, but ideally to catch up in a different way with different technologies and different processes which do not cause so much CO2 emissions. However, there are some really tragic statistics around, and I'm coming from my head rather than anything I've got before me on a piece of paper. But looking at Africa, the irony is that their per capita footprint on CO2 has gone down over the past 40 years, but the continental footprint has increased, and that's a factor of a much greater number of people with far less fair shares of their emissions, if you like. But overall, the numbers of people and the number of activity, the rate of activity, is meaning that as a greenhouse producing continent, it's increasing. Now, it's still pretty insignificant, and that's why I showed that Lunt graph. So one baby born in the UK, in terms of his or her greenhouse gas emissions over their lifetime on current per capita emissions, is equivalent to 50 babies born in Niger, one of the most impoverished, hardest pressed countries in the world. So absolutely, we have to address our consumption. But that's also why I pointed out that MIT study that, you know, I worked for Friends of the Earth for flipping years, pushing, we want to deal with, you know, let's get consumption down. We have failed spectacularly. And that's what the MIT study shows. It's the tragedy of it. It's that there was that sort of Victorian engineer, Jevons, the Jevons paradox. The cheaper energy is, the more people use, the more stuff they want. And we haven't addressed that as yet.
Okay, this is a tricky one. Tony Goodchild on this, aren't we hoping that consumption per head in the global south will increase? Well, of course, we want to have better lives together with better education, but that's a bit of a contradiction. We can't trade off population, I suppose, against their increase in consumption.
No, and that's the point of the SDGs. That, you know, all of those SDGs. I mean, I was looking at a piece of work which is a peer-reviewed academic study, and it's one of those things you look at and you think, oh my God, how are we going to get out of this? When you increase secondary education in girls, there is an academic study which shows a correlating diminution in biodiversity in that country. Now that seems, you know, how can that be? Girls are in education, they're having greater opportunities. Presumably it's around, from my recollection of reading, it's around increased economic activity, more infrastructure. There is a parallel reduction in biodiversity. So that's a sort of the development, sustainable development imbalance that we've got to address. So that's why we focused on the SDGs, because unless, as so many people and so many medics and doctors around the world are trying to point out, there is this huge unmet need for girls to have access to family planning. It's cheap. I mean, there was a calculation by a Scandinavian, I think it's called the Copenhagen Consensus in 2018, that every dollar spent on enabling family planning, meeting that unmet need, would return $230 in value to that, to the wider society of that country, because it would address so many different issues. So it's not a huge amount of money, but we have some very negative, and my goodness, if Mr. Trump gets back in, we will continue to have some negative impact. He reintroduced something called the global gag, which cut all US aid to any organization operating anywhere in the world that the US might be supporting if they were not 159% opposed to abortion under any circumstances, which meant that billions of dollars were cut to really good family planning, not abortion, but family planning programs meeting that unmet need. So that's an incredibly regressive move. So we're up against some real challenges. But I would argue that there are so many good things we can do that it is a no-brainer, never mind no regrets, to enable those girls and young women to have access to safe modern family planning, to manage down population with all the benefits of that, and to curb long-term climate change emissions.
Right, I'm conscious that we're running, we've got about 5 minutes left for more questions. I'll couple these two together. Pam Pence is asked how effective is speaking about the future of future children to reduce population in developed countries. Will Saunders is asking, in your opinion, what is more likely to happen? The wealthy West dramatically reduce their consumption, or the developing countries reduce their population? I put the two together because you can see that, are we trying to frighten the wealthy West into doing what they need to do?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about equity with disastrous consequences. I mean, the one thing that disappointed me about the Attenborough film, of those of you who watched it, was when they when they showed pictures of, there was a brief section of in A Life on Our Planet where they showed the devastation which could be coming on a bigger scale. They showed sort of burnt out pictures of forests and they showed coral bleaching and so forth. But because they're natural history producers and program makers, they even made that look beautiful. What I felt they should have shown was the burnt out town of Paradise in California and the burnt out towns in Australia. So in rich developed countries and some of the richest communities who were impacted by climate change. So we have to bring it home to people. It is hard. I mean, I have to be I have to be an optimist to do this job. I have to be an optimist because I've got 2 young girls, but it is very hard not to look at the future and see a pretty dystopian future if we're not making some massive changes pretty fast. And so I think we do have to not frighten, but make people aware of the choices. And if you've read Christiana Figueres's book, which is behind me, The Future We Choose, there are 2 paths. We are either going to hell on earth, or we're going to get out of it, but we're going to have hit some pretty hard knocks in the road. So I'm conflicted all the time about which approach to use, to be honest.
Okay. Yes, I think this other one, the questions are flooding in here, and it's unfortunate we don't have a vast amount of time to go to another session straight after this one. This relates really to the carbon emissions. Also, Rob, it's from Ed Gemmell, our managing director. Also, Rob, if we accept the UN's proposition, we need to take action to ensure we stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees within 10 years. Do you regard population as the most important intervention we should take, or should we concentrate more on the immediate carbon emission reductions and sequestration now and see population intervention as a medium-term solution? I think a lot of us wonder about this one.
Yeah, well, I think I think they have to go hand in hand, because you have to set in train things now on population to innate. Otherwise, we're tinkering at the edges. We will slow some stuff down. Yes, we can reduce our food waste. But just look at that MIT study. All these things which seem like such good solutions are not being taken up anything like fast enough. So it's really not either or. I wouldn't presume to go to COP26 as once upon a time when we could do things we were going to say it's only about population. That would be deeply arrogant and unhelpful. But I would say it's both together. You absolutely have to do it, not least because of the good it does for all those. I mean, it breaks my heart to think that the rate of poor practice in terms of child marriage, FGM, etc., are going up in parts of the world. It breaks my heart that young girls are not getting into school, not getting into education. It breaks my heart that there are more teenage pregnancies in parts of the UK in deprived areas because the government has closed down the Family Planning Association. There are deep injustices which we can address now, which will make a difference, which will contribute to climate change. But of course, yes, let's reduce food waste. Let's stop making unnecessary air travel flights. Let's use that old equation. The impacts on the earth are a combination of population times consumption / affluence times technology. Take any one of those letters out of that equation and it's harder for the other ones to work. So we have to do all of them together. And population brings a lot more benefits than just a single wind turbine does. Beautiful as they are, they don't help communities develop generally. They don't help girls fulfill their potential.
Right. Well, I'm afraid,
Bill,
ladies
can you
and
hear me, Bill?
gentlemen, it's time to close this meeting because we have another one following immediately afterwards. I apologize for this. I have to actually take personal responsibility for making these close running events happen. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you will enjoy the next event with Dave Gardner, who will be talking about population from probably an American perspective. Okay, thank you ever so much, Robin, for a most interesting and thorough presentation.